Hi, everyone. I think I'm going to get us started, at least with the introduction portion, knowing that you're all here to really hear from the panelists. Hello, everyone. I'm Michelle Boyd. I help lead Terner Labs, the nonprofit arm of UC Berkeley's Terner Center for Housing Innovation. We directly work with innovators across the nonprofit and for-profit sector with solutions to advance housing affordability and equity. We support small cohorts of organizations each year and give them funding and intensive support. We're really excited to be here with co-hosting this with the Economic Architecture Project to highlight really national leading innovations. We look at hundreds of innovators every year and are really impressed by those who have come together and that you're going to hear from today. So we focus this conversation on solutions for community ownership and rental housing. Stuart will talk a little bit more about why this is areas of interest and in need of structural innovation. So I'm going to get out of the way, but thank you for joining. I will let you know that this webinar is recorded. It will be posted to our websites and sent out to everyone who signed up for the event. So thank you so much for joining us. And let's get started. I'll pass it over to you, Stuart.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Stuart Yasgur. I'm a leadership group member at Ashoka, and I lead the Economic Architecture Project. I'd like to welcome you all to the conversation today. I'll keep my comments really brief, but I will say that, over the last year and a half to 2 years, we've had the chance to review the work of over 6,000 organizations that work in housing across the country. And in the course of doing that, we learned a lot, including the importance of remembering something that we all know really well. Homes in this work are often spoken of as financial assets or liabilities. But we all know that they're much more. Homes are where we live. It's where we live our lives. It's where we raise our families. They're the places where we return. And they're also the places to which we belong. Homes are also the building blocks of our communities. And the richness of all of that understanding what a home is and what it means to have a home is reflected in the term homeowner. I think it's incredibly telling that we don't have a term like that for people who pay for their homes with a rent check instead of a mortgage check. Instead, we have terms like tenants or residents or lessees. In so many ways, there's a bias against home renters that's built right into the structure of our markets. There are things like mortgage tax deductions and zoning laws, ease of eviction proceedings, and so many other things. The innovators that are on the panel today, in some ways, show us how different things could be if we redesign the market to make rental housing truly work. Their innovations show us that rental housing can be permanently affordable and secure, that home renters can build equity, and they can share in the benefits that accrue when their neighborhoods prosper, and that rental housing can respect, reflect, and nourish the communities. I want to thank each of the panelists for joining us today. I'm looking forward to an incredible conversation. And with that, I'm going to pass the baton to you, Tony.
Thank you, Stuart. And I'm thrilled to be moderating today's discussion with our excellent panelists. And I'm going to do what really good moderators do in these situations and quickly introduce each of our panelists with their organizational affiliations and locations and let them be the ones to share their detailed stories with you all at the beginning of this conversation. One thing I do want to note, if you have questions related to anything the panelists share in terms of content, the Q&A function is activated. Go ahead and post those questions there. We have someone monitoring that, and they'll feed those questions to us so we can incorporate your questions into the conversation as well. Without further ado, I'll just jump in and introduce all of our panelists briefly. There are 4 of them. First, Dr. Marisela Gomez, who is a council member with, and I love the name of this organization, Village of Love and Resistance in Baltimore, Maryland. We also have Zach Murray, who is the Organizing and Movement Building Director for the Guild in Atlanta, Georgia. We have Veronica Reed, Executive Director of Jane Place Neighborhood Sustainability Initiative in New Orleans, Louisiana. And then finally, we have Jason Dehaemers, Chief Project Officer of Trust Neighborhoods in Kansas City. And so I just want to jump in, being sensitive to our limited time together, and really start off with Jason if you would share maybe like 5 minutes of just a high-level description of the work that you do, a little bit about yourself would be great as well.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. Hello, everyone. Well, first of all, I just want to start by saying thanks to the Economic Architecture Project and Turner Labs for inviting us to participate today. So I'm Jason Dehaemers. I'm a co-founder of Trust Neighborhoods along with Kavya Shankar and David Kemper. My background is in corporate finance and try to bring that to our work. And yeah, so Trust Neighborhoods is a nonprofit that works with neighborhoods facing gentrification. And more specifically, we work with neighborhoods that have suffered from decades of racism embedded in our country's housing system. And neighborhoods whose residents now face a second injustice, which is displacement from their homes due to unaffordable rents, just as investment pours back in. And so what we do as Trust Neighborhoods is partner with established organizations in those same neighborhoods to set up a new development tool called the Mixed Income Neighborhood Trust, or MINT for short, because Mixed Income Neighborhood Trust is a mouthful. And so at its most, what is a MINT? At its most basic level, a MINT is a residential rental portfolio. But it's so much more than that. Everything about the model is intentionally designed to accomplish 3 goals. 1, to preserve affordability. 2, to give communities control over the development and ongoing operations of rental housing in their neighborhoods. And 3, to position the MINT to scale so it can fully meet the needs of the community. And so I just want to highlight a few important things, aspects of the model, each of which serves to advance at least one of those 3 goals. Firstly, MINTs rent homes at a variety of rates. So a majority of the units in the portfolio, portion varies, but let's just say for the sake of discussion here, 2/3 are preserved at the current levels of affordability, while a substantial minority, that is the other 1/3, are floated at unrestricted market rates. And so the idea behind this mix is that the market rates units, those 1/3, can grow to levels far above today's level as gentrification creeps in. And that drives profits, which can be used to subsidize the preservation of the affordability of those other 2/3 that I mentioned. And so this hits on an important point that I want to note about MINTs, is that they don't try to stop gentrification. Instead, they harness pricing pressure that gentrification brings, and in doing so protects residents from the downsides of gentrification, namely displacement, while at the same time ensuring that they get to take advantage of all the good parts that come with and all the opportunities that do come with investment in a community. So the second thing I want to highlight is, while Trust Neighborhoods is a nonprofit, MINTs are not. So MINTs are typically structured as LLCs and funded with investments and bank loans as opposed to grants. And the rationale here for this approach is that ties back to that 3rd goal I referenced around scale, is that a for-profit structure enables MINTs to access much larger pools of capital, which in turn allows them to grow larger and more effectively advance their purpose by promoting stability and sustainability. Final thing about the model that I just want to highlight before we hand it off and we can to the other folks, as control of a MINT rests with the community, not the investors, despite the fact that it is a for-profit structure. And we do this by kind of splitting the 2 components of ownership, economic interest on one hand, and then controlling interest on the other, and taking that controlling interest and placing it in a specialized legal structure called a perpetual purpose trust. And that trust has a legal obligation to advance a formal purpose that includes both promoting affordability and growing dividends to investors. You say, well, okay, that's weird, because those 2 things kind of go against each other. Like, how does that work? it's kind of tough to, have your cake and eat it too. And that's right. And so we intentionally set it up that way so that a balance needs to be struck between those two different things. And critically, members of the community decide how to strike that balance by serving on a committee that directs how that controlling trust basically manages the mint and directs the managers of the mint to carry out things in accordance with that purpose. So while I would love to geek out on the specifics of the model, and because there are a lot of them and it's a lot of fun if you're into that kind of thing like I am, it might take a while. So I just want to wrap here by noting a few specific things that we as an organization are particularly proud of or excited about right now. Much like the work of the other organizations represented here today, mints offer an affordable rental solution to neighborhoods sorely in need of one. And very often in neighborhoods where other solutions just don't work. And so that's really energizing for us. As of today, we have 2 mints up and running, one in Kansas City and one in Tulsa. And the Kansas City mint has actually been, which is about a little over a year old, has been developing so quickly that we're already out helping them raise more money to expand. And that's super exciting because, when we launched the Kansas City Mint or helped the neighborhood launch the Kansas City Mint, it was meant to be for the direct impact, and we wanted it to be a normal mint, but it was also the first one ever. And it was sort of meant to be a proof of concept. And the fact that we're out there raising more money on the back of a lot of success is super exciting. Beyond those 2 that we already have up and running, we have an exciting pipeline of prospective mints that stretch across the country in places that are as far-flung and different as Boston and Fresno. And so with all the successes we've seen here in the Midwest, we're excited to bring it to the coasts up and down the country too. And then final thing to note is just Trust Neighborhoods has received a generous grant from Arnold Ventures out of Texas to design and market a fund vehicle that will invest in mints across the country. And this is really exciting because it will meaningfully accelerate the pace of our work. The biggest constraint on growth of this model is that it relies heavily, at least in its current configuration, on fundraising at local level. And this will really be able to harness capital from around the country from institutions that are really interested in seeing new innovative models like this and the other ones that we'll hear about shortly, to really help get scale and more mints out there. So with that, Tony, I don't know, how do you want me to do? Just pass it back to you, or should I pop?
Yeah, you just pass it back to me. That'll
Okay.
be fine. Thank you for sharing that, Jason. And in the interest of our learning exploration today, I know each of you has a little bit different take on really collective ownership models. And so next, we want to hear from Marisela about her work in Baltimore.
Good afternoon, everyone. You can hear me okay?
Yes, we can, Marisela.
Wonderful. I'm in the car, apologies. I'm with VOLAR, Village of Love and Resistance, and we're in Baltimore. And this is the time that we're doing our food mutual aid. And so in the car, as we continue to do that right outside, and we're jamming some good vibes. So if you even catch that. So as I mentioned, the name of our organization, a nonprofit, is VOLAR, Village of Love and Resistance. And our mission is basically we talk about reclaiming and stewarding land through using maybe three strategies: organizing people, so organizing a base of people. The majority of us on our caretaking council are organizers, so we come with a strong organizing background. having previously fought a lot of gentrification and now offering an alternative to gentrification. So building people power, using a community investment trust fund for residents to be able to co-own land. And then the third strategy, if you will, is healing, recognizing that this historical way of land taking and serial forced displacement in our particularly Black and low income communities have resulted in lots of fragmentation and lots of health disparities. And so we recognize that this work of economic justice has to be partnered hand in hand with healing justice. And so healing is not just an economic process, it's a body and mind process. And so we're also, one of our big strategies is also healing. I know that this forum is focused on the investment aspect, and so I'll focus in on there. But just to say that one of the things I think that makes us different from other types of investment models that are gaining momentum as far as community opportunity for community to own and have decision making is we're bringing in an organizing of people as a huge part. So residents who become members of the Community Investment Trust are people who are also part of VOLAR's membership, doing organizing, doing popular political education on the history of uneven development, on why it is the right of people to take back the city. And so we are connected, very much connected to this understanding of radical re-education of the people. And we feel this is a different way that we're bringing in the process of leadership development, because it's great to say community owned, and we hear this actually a whole lot around, and having been doing community work for many, many years, decades, community have to also be ready to do that leadership, to take on that leadership. And in some of our historically redlined urban renewal areas, like we are in Baltimore and East Baltimore, there's a curve, a learning curve, a knowledge accumulation curve for people to move into those leadership positions. And so that popular political education is a big part of what we're doing. Two things I'm going to touch on, and before I turn over to the next brilliant process that is being shared here, is the Community Investment Trust Fund. And so we're actually replicating and innovating on a model started with Mercy Corps in Portland, Oregon, and you'll hear someone else speak about that model. They're also replicating in Atlanta. And so what this model says is we bought a building, well, two buildings really, 17,000 square feet. And we own that building, and we're in the process of establishing a community investment trust such that residents can purchase a share and become an investor basically for as little as $10 a month and up to $100 a month. And we can get into more details maybe in the question period. And that affords them to receive a return or dividend at the end of the year. They can take their money out at any time with no penalty. What we're trying to do is similar to what Portland is doing with the residents in their plaza, is to assure 6% or something like that dividend or return on investment, which, as you know, is phenomenal. But this is targeted or focused for our local investors, meaning our community investors. And we're actually defining, like Mercy Corps, the zip codes surrounding the building. But we're going a little bit further, and this is how we're innovating. We're in a redlined area. We're in a historic urban renewal area. We're in a place, a neighborhood of majority Black, where our buildings are less than 3/4 mile from about 4 to 5 public housing, either public housing complexes or heavily subsidized housing. And so in our bylaws, we name that only those who come out of this generational history of gentrification can be investors to receive that kind of return. We can't name race in the bylaws because they'll come after us. But really, we really are about redistributing wealth. We really are about figuring out how do we get at this racial equity that everybody and their brother have been talking about in the last 2 years. And still, we still don't see a real landing of that in some of the way funding is happening. And we're going to practice it, meaning we're naming it. If you don't come out of these places where we're really focusing on getting money into someone who is living in public housing, to be able to say, look down the street, and that's what we say all the time. You see the building down there? Do you want to say that I own that? I'm part of the ownership of that? And that's the opening conversation we have. So that's a community investment trust, and there's lots to say about that. And I think I'm not sure how much time I had, so maybe I'll go ahead and stop here. And happy to respond to any questions that come up. Thank you.
Thank you, Marisela. We'll get into more details during the Q&A, and I've got some questions that'll help dig in a little bit. But next, we're going to hear from Zach in Atlanta. Talk about your model with us, Zach.
Great, thanks, Tony. It's a pleasure to join you in this conversation and to be here with all the great panelists. And thanks to the Terner Center for putting on this webinar. Just a little bit about my background. As Tony mentioned, I'm the Organizing and Movement Building Director for the Guild. And previously to working with the Guild, I was on staff at Oakland Community Land Trust and helped to create the City of Oakland's first dedicated fund for CLTs. And then also was on staff at Granite Solutions Network and worked on state and local policies, primarily inclusionary housing and affordable housing preservation. And so the Guild was started in 2017. And actually, as of last week, we've officially converted to a 100% worker-owned co-op. So we're still kind of celebrating that. But we have three main buckets of work. The first bucket is development. We build affordable mixed-use housing and commercial retail spaces. And these are primarily intended for long-term community activists, members of the community, entrepreneurs, artists. And we are informed by a value that housing is a human right and not a commodity for profit. And so in addition to that, we work with other community-based developers to offer technical assistance and services that help to promote community wealth building. Our second bucket of work is that we are heavily centered in community ownership. And so drawing on the community land trust model, we create community owned and community governed mixed use real estate models via a structure called the Community Stewardship Trust. And as Marisela mentioned, this really draws on the model that Mercy Corps developed in their Community Investment Trust. And so the features of this Community Stewardship Trust are permanent affordability of housing, resident control, collective decision-making, and the value of taking real estate off the speculative market and returning it to the community's hands so that it can really serve as a wealth building tool for folks who have been shut out of those opportunities. And so similar to the model that Marisela mentioned, the financial returns from the projects are shared with all the community investors and all stakeholders get to inform the future of the project in order to create a real pathway of self-determination for communities of color that are increasingly locked out of development opportunities in Atlanta. And so our first pilot project is called 918 Dill, and it involved the acquisition of a vacant one-story retail space in a community called Capitol View. And we're currently in the process of submitting our building permits and intend to break ground this year. But the project will involve the rehabilitation of that ground floor space and the addition of 2 stories that will have 18 units of permanently affordable housing, including housing that's open to folks who have Section 8 vouchers. And so the CST, the Community Stewardship Trust, will invite members immediately of the Capitol View community, but also folks who live in the 30310 zip code, which is the historic west side of Atlanta, primarily African-American community, to become investors on a sliding scale between $10 to $100 a month. And our intent is really to engage those folks who in Atlanta we call legacy residents, folks who have lived here for many years, folks who are traditionally a part of this community, have helped to build the community that lots of folks are choosing to invest in now. And these are predominantly Black folks and many are low income. And so our outreach model really involves, similar to the work happening in Baltimore, engaging these folks as an opportunity for them to have decision-making power over development that's happening in their community. In addition to the 18 units of affordable housing, the ground floor retail space will include Capitol View's first grocery store in decades. It's a community like much of the west side of Atlanta and south side of Atlanta that has suffered through food apartheid on a tremendous level. And so the grocery store is a Black woman-owned chain called Levin. And the other retail space will be a shared community workspace where we'll invite folks as members to have access to shared office space, shared conference space, to build a community asset where folks can launch their businesses. The grocery store will also include 3 commercial kitchen spaces. The third bucket of work that we've been developing at the Guild is an integrated capital fund, and we've called our fund Ground Cover. And it uses integrated non-extractive capital to invest in scaling up our model of community-owned real estate, like CSTs, Community Stewardship Trusts, in order to create a pathway of ownership for Black and Brown people. And so the integrated capital is a coordinated use of different forms of financial capital and non-financial resources as well. So that includes foundation money, it includes fundraising from investors in order to create and build an economy rooted in justice, equity, and solidarity. And so the intent is to help provide really cheap, accessible capital to folks so that they can quickly move to acquire land and build more housing, more commercial space that serves the community in South Atlanta's rapidly gentrifying sections. And in building the fund, we're working to ensure that people, again, otherwise locked out of investment opportunities, get to be a part of shaping decisions about how we raise and deploy capital. And so a lot of what our work aims to do in those 3 buckets of work is to build community wealth, to expand democratic practices in the space of community development, and to open up access to capital for Black and Brown and other communities of color. And I think with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Tony.
Thanks, Zach. And finally, we're going to hear from Veronica about her program and her work.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is Veronica Reed, and I'm the Executive Director of Jane Place Neighborhood Sustainability Initiative in New Orleans, Louisiana. We are a community land trust, and we were founded in 2008. We have 3 pillars of work, which I'll introduce briefly and then talk just a little more in detail about each one. The first pillar of work is that we develop permanently affordable rental housing in our community land trusts. The second pillar of work is that we use community-based research and advocacy to move policies and programs forward, which support rental households and ensure that in a state like Louisiana that has no rental or tenant protections, that we chip away at that lack of tenant protections by creating those programs and use that advocacy to support them. And thirdly, we work with tenants by supporting organizing, tenant engagement, tenant education to ensure that tenants have all the information that they need to actually take ownership of their own future and sort of organize against landlords, because again, in a state with no tenant protections, landlords tend to have more power, and our goal is one by one to get rid of the most egregious of those landlords, and the tenants are doing a really good job of that, and we're happy to be their partner. Just in more detail, as a community land trust, we're a fairly traditional land trust, except we don't do any home ownership. All of our properties are rental properties, and we have a strong stewardship model in addition to being solely focused on rental housing. Our neighborhood is a traditional single family neighborhood of with 1 and 2, what we call here doubles, but most places in the rest of the world call duplexes. And right now, the majority of our properties are mortgage free because we do believe when we say community ownership, we do believe that. And so if we can have the deed in our pocket, we're always happier than if the deed is with a bank. But so right now we only have 2 properties with mortgages, and we're very pleased with that current situation. And the other big piece of of our work with our tenants, or that our tenants believe in, is stewardship, both in terms of the leadership of the organization, but also in terms of family financial stability. So we have programs that support family financial stability of our tenants. And that the biggest one, which we started during the pandemic, which probably wasn't the best time to start it, but we're hoping to get more active participation, is a savings program where we match 1-for-1 for every dollar that a household saves, up to $50 a month, we will match that $50. And that's a 24-month program, and it's fully funded by philanthropic dollars. And then we also do things in terms of supporting family financial stability, like raise dollars, so that we can have things like private rental assistance, so that when our tenants have situations where they need assistance, decisions can be made by our stewardship committee to provide rental assistance, so that tenants don't have to look, one, outside of the land trust for support, and two, can find, sort of get over any hurdles, whether they're medical, but any emergency, and have that financial stability. So again, traditional land trust with, I think, a strong stewardship model. Secondly, our advocacy work that's based on research. We have spent a lot of time focusing on those things that impact the rental housing market here in New Orleans. We first learned that we could have that impact when we worked with some tenants who were suffering from expiring use of some low-income housing tax credits. And we were able to work with those tenants and get a sort of as positive outcome as possible. You know, they still lost their housing in that particular complex, but we were able to get them housing counselors and some other supports. So when they transitioned out of those units and into others, it wasn't a shock, but a transition with support from financial support from the city. We then, in partnership with others, tackled short-term rentals. Again, looking at data on the impact that short-term rentals were having in our neighborhoods, and we're able to make changes. We were able to advocate for changes to the city's short-term rental ordinance, and therefore impact how short-term rentals were affecting the supply of market rate and affordable housing in neighborhoods. As a city of where tourism is a big part of our market, the sort of having the real New Orleans experience was very popular, but that real New Orleans experience was impacting our ability to house local residents. And more recently, we fought for and won right to counsel in eviction court. And we got a 1-year program in December of last year for 2022. And I'm happy to say that this morning we won a permanent ordinance and funding for a permanent right to counsel program for the city of New Orleans, so that now tenants will be represented in eviction court by counsel, therefore leveling the playing field for tenants. And those tenants tend to overwhelmingly be, unfortunately, in this city, Black women. They represent about 58% of all folks who get evicted in the city of New Orleans. So that's the kind of work that our advocacy represents. And finally, our organizing and community engagement work just literally hopes, or our goal is to help empower tenants to take control of what's happening at the community level, at the complex level, and change what's going on. And so, for example, one of the most notorious landlords in the city, we're partnering in a lawsuit with tenants and Fannie Mae against this particular landlord because it's a slum environment that you wouldn't believe existed today. And so those are the kinds of things that we do to ensure that, again, in a world with no tenant protections, we chip away at that lack of tenant protections to empower tenants. And that's the work that Jane Place does.
Thank you, Veronica. Very compelling presentation by all of the panelists. And I noted there's some differences in how you all are approaching collective ownership. And I want to probe into that a little bit with my first question for you all, which is, collective ownership models are commonly set up to operate in perpetuity. So how do you ensure a resilient, effective governance structure and one that can be flexible without losing touch with its values and the mission of the organization over time? And I'm going to start with Zach.
That's a good question. And you caught me off guard a little bit. So yeah, I think it's really about, I think Marisela mentioned this in her presentation, political education, and really working to build deeper knowledge among community members around not just the development aspects, but also the aspects around governance and how we can share in resources and how we can build collectively together, educating folks around the alternatives that are possible, in addition to the sort of traditional way of doing things where an individual buys a mortgage or an individual rents a place, that there are really opportunities outside of those sort of polar spaces where the community can build and thrive. And I think the other part is in making, in ensuring that development is actually relevant to the existing community's needs. A lot of times community folks build the energy, the attractiveness of a community, but don't get to reap the benefit when the prices go up and the taxes are too high or the rents become too high and they're displaced. And so we want to make sure that we're building developments that are responsive to the community's needs, that are accessible to the community's needs. And I think that helps to expand folks' ability to participate, but also their ability to remain in the community when there are literally developments being built and units being built, commercial spaces that are being built to serve for the economic development purposes in Atlanta, in particular, of low-income Black folks who oftentimes are excluded from a lot of the existing development. In fact, in Atlanta, only 1% of the affordable housing that's being built with all the city funding is being built for folks at 0 to 30% of the area median income. And so there is a lot of exclusionary development happening. And our intent, within the Guild is to serve those folks by building housing, but also partnering with community organizations who best know the people in the community. And so our second project after Dill is a partnership in a community called Pittsburgh with a local organizing group whose intention is to really serve community residents, to provide space for workers in the community. And so I think that helps to expand democratic practice and to ensure the long-term resilience and sustainability of a project.
Great. Jason, what's your take on that? How does governance really work in the MIT model in perpetuity?
Yeah, so resilience and flexibility are so important and something that we care a lot about. And I gotta say that we're really lucky to have a great partner to help us think through that, and the Purpose Foundation, which is based out of the Bay Area in Berlin. And they've spent a ton of time putting together this perpetual purpose trust model that we use as the governance and making sure that it's just that resilient. And so their model, which they've put together, and we've kind of taken that and put it on top of the Mint. It combines three critical components. One is a really well-crafted purpose statement. So what is this here to do? And like I said before, that's sort of it's a balance of doing of defining the purpose that's vague enough to be flexible, but also specific enough to be resilient and to maintain those values. And then secondly, and this can't be overstated, is just thoughtful selection of the trustees, because it's only as good as that purpose, that legal entity is only as good as the people who manage it. And so I don't want to come back to that, but the third piece, which I think is really critical, and where a lot of other perpetual governance mechanisms or systems break down, is that there aren't enforcement mechanisms where they're exposed to capture. And Purpose has put a ton of work into coming up with effective enforcement mechanisms to make sure that those trustees are indeed putting that purpose first, or maybe the purpose needs to be changed. as time goes on. So we've benefited a lot from their thought of that, and are very much aligned with their approach. On the purpose and what or how we select those trustees is, a mint the engagement before we actually form a mint can take over a year. And it has, I think, for each of our rollouts that we've already launched, and likely will be for most of the ones that we have in our pipeline. And most of that time is not spent trying to raise dollars or whether it be from banks or from fundraisers. It's talking with the community to ask what it is that they want, and for them to start, all the residents to kind of understand what the purpose is and get on the same page with that. And so making sure you have that is really critical. And then I think that the final leg of how Trust Neighborhoods approaches this is we're working to develop additional checks beyond even what's kind of put forth by the Purpose Foundation in their model. And Trust Neighborhoods does not have any control in a mint. That does reside with the community. But Trust Neighborhoods does have the standing to say, hey, something's not going right over in this mint. And so we are building up Trust Neighborhoods as a long-standing institution that can be there to make sure that if something is threatening the values over time, that we're there to help with that. And then maybe even beyond that, one of the reasons why we want to have so many mints out there is we want to create a community of mints, not unlike the community of CLTs that you work with every day. And having those other mints, it just creates more eyes looking out for other folks who are in and around mints across the country, protecting them against bad actors.
Great. I want to shift gears a little bit. There's a question from one of the audience members, and Veronica, I want to ask you, and it's how are elected officials collaborating with you? Are you working together, and how's that going?
Well, we have a very new city council, and surprisingly, today our 7-member city council voted 7-0 in support of our right to counsel. So I don't know, maybe we have a pretty decent relationship with some of them, depending on the issue, right? But that was the kind of thing how do you say no to that, right? I don't really know. But our next big hurdle is healthy homes. Again, where there are no tenant protections, what's another way we can protect tenants? And so having a healthy homes ordinance with minimum habitability standards, and then a rental registry, and a no so that landlords can't retaliate against tenants who actually then report them. We'll see what our elected officials say then, because I do believe that the landlord lobby will have a lot to say about that. And so we may not have 7-0 then. It may be more like 3-4, and we're going to have to maybe sort of really work hard to bring other folks to this side. But it's really about education, right? And we just work really hard to educate. That's here in New Orleans. New Orleans is a blue dot in a red state. So look, the rest of the state, all I can do is shake my head. But I do think we have we attempt to have good working relationships, because we try to literally approach them with facts. This sort of research-based approach we have really is not about, we don't prey on their emotions. We don't use anecdotes. We bring facts to the table, and that does help us sort of bring people to our side, because again, it's an education piece, and it's really hard to refute hard data. So yeah, it tends to help. And I do believe I believe we're well respected, but that could just be a little bit of hubris on our parts. I don't know.
Thank you, Veronica. Marisela, is there anything you want to add from your perspective in Baltimore around that?
Sure. This is the question around the support from the political officials.
Elected officials, yes.
Elected officials, yeah. Let's see, how can we not get in trouble here? I would say it's for us, it comes down to how are we supported in getting funding, right? And so we definitely speak and have relationships with our local city council representative and other folks from other districts. And that's one level of support, the words. And then there's when you apply for the big grant dollars, right? The $800,000 grant, the $500,000 grant, the state grant, the city grants for housing development. And where do we get those funding? I'd have to say if we base it on the funding, government stream funding, I'd say we have a really poor relationship with our elected officials. And I'm using US elected officials, but I'm speaking government because they're connected and they talk to each other. The person who's looking and reviewing the grant, the regional person representing an area and who speaks up for a grant. There's all these connections going on. So even though those people aren't elected officials, they're also within this whole microcosm of listening to each other and hearing from each other what they think of a particular program, particular organization that's doing the work. And so based on the funding that we've received so far, I'd say not a good relationship with government that I'm equating to elected, the perceptions of, the elected officials all say, yes, good, great, Baltimore, we need to move forward in these ways. But honestly, until we get the kind of support, resources support that the big developers get, like right behind us with Old Town Mall, this 200-acre project from the waterfront where, 800 public housing units being demolished for mixed income housing and et cetera, and the 35 million choice grant that went into that, a private developer doing that. Until we see that kind of subsidized support for these kinds of projects that are Black and brown led in a majority Black city, I'd say we're still moving maybe in the direction of what Veronica's talking about. We're not there yet.
Thank you for that very candid response. I appreciate that. And that's the tension in this work of trying to navigate all of those kinds of relationships and situations. I want to kind of turn it around though, and sort of in our remaining time, kind of go around and to everybody and say, what's on your wish list of the kind of support that you need in order to expand the scope and impact of your work? Zach, why don't you take the first stab at that?
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate what Veronica lifted up in terms of the right to counsel, because we're working to, part of my role here with the Guild is to help support the ecosystem. And so we're partnered with an organization called the Housing Justice League that's advocating for just that, a right to counsel, because like Louisiana, Georgia's a state where there aren't very many protections for tenants. And so there are things that the city government can do now, like promote legal counsel for folks who are evicted. And in addition to that, the city recently passed a housing trust fund. And so we're working with the Housing Justice League and other partners to ensure that funding is prioritized for affordable housing preservation and community ownership opportunities. And I think in addition to the sort of public policy things on the side of capital and I think we probably all can agree to this, is there's just a need for more capital to what Marisela is talking about, both the public capital in terms of subsidies from the federal level on down, but in addition to that, private capital, foundations often have really stringent requirements that don't support these types of projects that are really desperately needed in our communities. And so there's a need for a real interrogation of why capital is not available for these projects that we know have a really great public benefit, that have a really great healing benefit. And so part of what our ground cover fund is attempting to do is to highlight that point, that there are ways that people can positively invest and meaningfully invest in community development in ways that promote the long-term health and well-being. But it's still a challenge on a lot of fronts to bring in capital into these projects because there is such a expectation of return. And we, I think, have a different interpretation of what return looks like. Return looks like people being able to stay or return to their communities. It looks like folks being able to thrive and to build and grow wealth in their communities, in these marginalized redline communities. And so we're pushing really hard on, and in alliance with groups here in Atlanta on our council to do more. And we're pushing really hard on the private capital front as well to ensure that they're really investing and putting their money where the talk is, so to speak.
Veronica, what about you? What's on your wish list?
Easy to access liquid capital. So I mean, our work is as it relates to our affordable rental housing is very much rooted in anti-displacement and anti-gentrification, right? We work in a neighborhood, mid-city, that is seeing a lot of speculation, and for every, when a house is purchased by an investor, it is forever lost to the affordable market. And so if we have an opportunity to purchase a house, we basically have to be quick. We have to be able to say we can close in 60 days. We can't wait for the city. We can't wait for city funds to do that. And there's only so much flexibility that we have if we're trying to take out a mortgage. And so we're working on creating an internal revolving loan fund so that we will have those dollars to do that. And I'll give you an example. We purchased a house last fall, which was right next door to the first property that we first developed in 2016. It was very important to us as an organization to not let that property go to a speculator. And so when I saw the heir, and they had the sign out for sale by owner, I was like, well, okay, we will offer you your asking price and we'll close all cash in 45 days. Did I have the all cash in 45 days? Of course not, but you kind of have to put it out in the universe to make it happen, right? And so I put that out in the universe and we were able to purchase that house. But we also did create this idea that when we purchase estate properties, we have made this decision that we will be naming those properties after the family in a way that represents that family and honors who they were. And so here in New Orleans, all these historic properties on St. Charles Avenue have big plaques. And so we're going to put big plaques on properties in these modest homes in mid-city also. And so, yeah, so I want liquid capital to be able to do that. Yeah.
Great. We're running out of time, but Marisela, I want to get your number one thing on your wish list.
Yeah, I'm the same thing that was said by my two colleagues previous is money. We need cash and we need grants, right? We've gotten a lot of offers from good-minded people to offer us loans. And when we try to explain that, no, we need grants because even your patient loan of 10 years, in 10 years we have to repay that, then we have to look to see, can we, instead of going up with the return to our local investors, when we have to start returning to you, we have to go down on the return to them. And so if you're really talking about redistributing wealth, and I don't even like this term, quite frankly, growing wealth, because $10 a month for a year, that is not wealth. So I think we need to really also unpack that a little bit. So we stopped saying growing wealth. What we say now is we're starting to build money and trying to have some money that we can keep growing so that in 10 or 20, 30 years, you can decide if you want to send a child to college or something like that. But to call it wealth and equate wealth with what we understand wealth, like white wealth, top 5% wealth to be, it's really almost, as we would say, a sin. So we need that grant. We don't need loans, we need grants, because the grants will really allow us to start to redistribute and to start to put some foundation, some grounding in our historically disinvested community who have never had this opportunity. That's the only way we're going to move toward equity. And that understanding is still so lacking in so many places that are talking about redistributing wealth. So grant, grant, grant.
Thank you, Marisela. And Jason, I'm giving you a chance to answer, but I want to wrap it up in an audience question as well, because something I think you and I can address. There was a question about how can my community affordable housing project get into a MENT or community land trust program. On the CLT side, groundedsolutions.org, our website, has a CLT startup hub. Zach is very familiar with that, as is Veronica. We provide training and resources for folks who are interested in community land trusts. But Jason, in our remaining time, what's your number one thing on your wish list, and how can folks get into a MENT?
Okay, so I'll start with the second. So how they get at trustneighborhoods.com, or they can also email me at jason.dehaemers@trustneighborhoods.com. There's a place where you can go in on the website and submit basically your information. I think I actually had two, and one is permanent capital, which we were making some progress with. And I think that the rest of the panelists have sort of kind of really driven home how critical that is. So we're on the same page there. The one I would add is, would really like to see more engagement from all levels of government. And that's everything from funding to tax abatements to enforcement to help, because the competition out there for acquiring units is really, really stiff right now. And so enforcing some sort of enforcement, whether it's codes or whatever, that will help make it harder for bad actors and easier for us just to tip the scales a little bit. I think that would go a really, really long way.
Well, thanks to all of you, our panelists. We're within the time. Thanks to our hosts at the Terner Center and the Economic Architecture Project for giving us this opportunity. Hopefully, it's just the beginning of more conversation, which is what we need to have about these models. So I really appreciate all of the hard work you all and your organizations are doing. You know, Grounded Solutions, we're here, we're pushing for housing with what we call lasting affordability, making sure that it's there for the future generations that need it. So thanks again, and that's the end of our time.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.